My name is Sophia Carter, and I am 35 years old. For most of my life, I believed family was the one place you never had to question your place. No matter how messy life got, no matter how far apart people drifted, there was always supposed to be this quiet understanding that you belonged. That belief stayed with me longer than I like to admit, even when the small signs started appearing signs that something about my place in the family was slowly, quietly changing. At first, nothing felt serious enough to name. That was part of what made it so confusing. There was no big fight, no harsh words thrown across the room, no moment dramatic enough to point to and say, that's when everything shifted. Instead, it crept in through moments so subtle they were easy to brush off if you really wanted to. Conversations that moved forward without pausing for my input. Plans that somehow came together without anyone thinking to loop me in until the last minute. Jokes that landed a little too close to something personal, followed by quick laughter that made it awkward to question them without looking overly sensitive. In the beginning, I told myself exactly what most people probably would. Families get busy. People get distracted. Not every missed moment means something deeper. I repeated those thoughts often enough that they almost sounded convincing. Almost, because even while I was making excuses for them, there was a small, persistent discomfort building quietly in the background, like my instincts were noticing something my loyalty didn't want to admit yet. I kept showing up the way I always had. I called to check in. I remembered birthdays without needing reminders. I volunteered to help when someone mentioned they were overwhelmed, even casually. If anything, I leaned in harder. The way people do when they feel a connection starting to slip and don't want to be the reason it breaks. Part of me believed that if I just stayed consistent enough, present enough, whatever distance I was sensing would eventually smooth itself out. But instead of closing the gap, my effort seemed to disappear into it. There was one dinner that stuck with me longer than it should have. Everyone was gathered around the table, conversations overlapping the way they always did when the energy in the room was high. I waited for a natural pause before speaking, the way I always tried to, and finally shared something that had been weighing on me. I didn't even get halfway through before someone jumped in with an entirely different topic. Just like that, the moment moved on. Forks clinked. Laughter picked back up. No one circled back to what I had said. I remember sitting there, my sentence unfinished, feeling that strange mix of heat and cold settle in my chest. Not anger, at least not yet. It was more like confusion wrapped in embarrassment. The kind that makes you quietly question whether you somehow misread the timing, or spoke too softly or simply expected too much, from a moment that wasn't meant to hold your words. So I did what I had trained myself to do. I smiled. I let the conversation keep moving. I told myself it wasn't worth making awkward. But moments like that didn't stay isolated. Over the following weeks, I started noticing the same pattern repeating in different forms. Group messages where my replies were the only ones that didn't spark a response. Family plans that I heard about after they were already set, usually followed by a casual, "Oh, we figured you were busy." Invitations that felt less like genuine inclusion and more like polite afterthoughts. None of it was loud enough to confront. None of it came with clear evidence I could hold up without sounding overly dramatic. And maybe that's why it worked for so long. Because every time something felt off, I gave them the benefit of the doubt before I gave my own instincts the chance to speak. I told myself they didn't mean anything by it, that everyone was just caught up in their own lives, that I was lucky to even have a family that stayed this connected in the first place. Gratitude can be a powerful thing, but sometimes, it also makes you ignore what's right in front of you. Still, I kept trying. I showed up early when there were gatherings. I offered help before anyone had to ask. I stayed present in conversations even when my contributions seemed to drift past unnoticed. I convinced myself that consistency mattered, that loyalty eventually balanced things out. But quietly, almost imperceptibly, something inside me was beginning to keep track, not out of bitterness, but out of growing awareness. The more effort I gave, the more it felt like my presence had become something they simply expected rather than something they valued. There were moments when the dismissals were wrapped so neatly in politeness that calling them out would have made me look unreasonable. A distracted nod when I spoke. A quick subject change right after I finished a sentence. Someone checking their phone mid-conversation while I was still talking. Each instance small enough to overlook on its own. But stacked together, they built a quiet weight that followed me home more nights than I wanted to admit. What hurt most wasn't any single moment. It was the slow realization that I was starting to feel optional in spaces where I had always believed I was essential. And even then, I wasn't ready to fully accept it. I kept defending them in my own head, kept reminding myself that families go through phases, that maybe everyone was just stressed, that maybe I was reading too deeply into things that had perfectly reasonable explanations. It was easier to question my own sensitivity than to face what the pattern might actually mean. But late at night, when everything was quiet and there were no distractions left to soften the truth, the same uncomfortable thought kept surfacing no matter how many times I tried to push it away. If nothing had really changed, why did I suddenly feel like I was standing just slightly outside of where I used to belong? I kept telling myself I was imagining it, but the pattern was getting harder to ignore. If I had simply stayed quiet forever, maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe I would have kept smiling through the discomfort and telling myself families go through phases. But the truth is, there comes a point when pretending everything is fine starts to feel heavier than the risk of speaking up. For me, that moment didn't come with anger. It came with exhaustion. The quiet kind that builds slowly when you've been trying to hold something together almost entirely on your own. The first time I gently brought it up, I was careful, almost painfully careful. I chose a calm moment, softened my tone, and picked my words like someone trying not to step on anything fragile. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't list examples. I simply said that lately, I had been feeling a little pushed to the side. That sometimes it felt like I was present in the room but not really included in the moment. Even saying it out loud made my chest tighten, because a part of me was still hoping they would immediately understand what I meant. For a brief second after I finished speaking, the room went quiet. And in that silence, I felt something close to relief. But it didn't last. The shift came quickly, so quickly it almost made me question whether I had imagined the tension in the first place. Someone let out a small sigh, the kind people make when they think something is being blown out of proportion. Another person gave me a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. And then the words started to come, smooth and calm, and carefully dismissive in a way that made them harder to argue with. They told me I was reading too much into things, that everyone had been busy, that no one was intentionally pushing me aside. The more they spoke, the more the focus quietly moved away from what I was feeling and onto how I was reacting. Somehow, without anyone raising their voice, the conversation stopped being about the distance I had been noticing and started being about my sensitivity. I remember nodding slowly, even as something inside me sank, because this wasn't the understanding I had hoped for. It was the beginning of a pattern. Over the next several weeks, every attempt I made to close the gap seemed to backfire in the exact same way. I tried being lighter about it, mentioning things in passing instead of serious conversations. I tried choosing better timing, bringing it up when everyone seemed relaxed and open. I even tried adjusting my tone, making sure nothing I said could be mistaken for blame. But no matter how carefully I approached it, the outcome rarely changed. If I mentioned feeling left out, I was told I was overthinking. If I pointed out a specific moment, I was told it wasn't intentional. If I went quiet afterward, someone would casually joke that I was being dramatic. Each response was calm, reasonable, polite, even, and somehow, that made it hurt more, because nothing they said was harsh enough to clearly call out, but the message underneath was becoming impossible to ignore. What I was feeling didn't seem important enough for anyone to really sit with. Instead of leaning in with curiosity or concern, they kept gently redirecting the focus back onto me. My reactions, my timing, my expectations. Little by little, the doubt I had been trying to push away started creeping back in stronger than before. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was expecting too much. Maybe I was the one making things uncomfortable. For a while, I almost convinced myself of it. But then came the moment that finally unsettled me in a way I couldn't smooth over. It happened during a family gathering that, on the surface, looked completely normal. Laughter filled the room, conversations overlapped. Everything had the same easy energy it always did. At one point, I tried to join in, adding a small comment to the discussion. No one responded. Not rudely, just nothing. The conversation simply moved forward, as if my voice had never entered the space. Normally, I would have brushed it off. But this time, I paid closer attention. A few minutes later, someone else made almost the exact same point I had just made, and suddenly the room reacted. Heads turned. People responded. The conversation expanded. That was the moment something inside my chest went very, very still. Because it wasn't just about being overlooked anymore. It was about the growing realization that I was slowly being pushed to the background in ways that were becoming harder to explain away. Later that night, I sat alone replaying the evening in my head, trying one last time to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was bad timing. Maybe I had spoken too quietly. Maybe I was just tired and reading into things again. I wanted desperately to believe one of those explanations, but the pattern was getting too consistent. Too familiar. Too easy for everyone else to ignore. And that's when the hardest truth of all started to settle in. Slow and uncomfortable, but impossible to fully push away. They weren't just accidentally overlooking me anymore. Little by little, they were choosing to. And the more I tried to fix it, the more I felt myself being pushed even further aside. The shift didn't happen in one dramatic decision. There was no night where I sat up in bed and suddenly declared I was done trying. If anything, it happened quietly. So quietly that no one around me seemed to notice at first. But inside me, something had finally reached its limit. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just in clarity. For the first time, I started to wonder what would happen if I stopped doing all the emotional work that had been holding everything together. So I didn't make an announcement. I didn't confront anyone again. I simply began to pull back. It started small. The daily check-in texts I used to send without thinking became less frequent. The way I used to be the first one to suggest plans slowly faded. When family conversations popped up in the group chat, I responded, but I stopped being the one to keep the thread alive. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was still present, still polite, still showing up when I was directly invited. But I wasn't stretching myself thin trying to stay centered in spaces where I had been quietly pushed aside. At first, nothing changed. Days passed the same way they always had. Conversations continued. Plans moved forward. No one rushed in to ask why I seemed quieter, and strangely, that hurt more than I expected. Because part of me, maybe the most hopeful part, had still believed someone might notice right away. That someone might ask if I was okay. But the silence stretched on, calm and undisturbed, and it forced me to sit with a truth I had been avoiding for months. When I stopped chasing the connection, it didn't immediately chase me back. That realization settled heavily in my chest, but it also brought something else with it. Space. For the first time in a long while, my energy wasn't constantly drained by trying to keep everything balanced. I wasn't overanalyzing every conversation or replaying every small dismissal in my head. The quiet distance I had created started to feel steadier than I expected. And then, slowly, almost cautiously, the first ripple appeared. It came through a casual message one evening. Short, light, someone asking why I'd been so quiet lately. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Not because the question was dramatic, but because of what it represented. For months, I had been trying to express how pushed aside I'd been feeling, and it had barely registered. But the moment my energy shifted just slightly, it had been noticed. I kept my reply calm, told them I'd just been busy. Old habits still lingered. But after that message, something subtle in the dynamic began to change. The next family gathering felt different. Not obviously tense. No one confronted me. But I noticed the small things the way I always did. Conversations that used to flow right past me now paused for half a second longer, like people were recalibrating without fully realizing it. Someone asked my opinion on something minor, something they usually would have decided without me. Another person checked in briefly when I was quieter than usual. Each moment was small, easy to overlook if I hadn't already been paying close attention. But I noticed. And more importantly, I didn't rush to fill the space the way I used to. Normally, any hint of distance would have triggered the old version of me to jump in and smooth everything over. I would have reassured everyone that nothing was wrong, that everything was fine, that I was still exactly where they expected me to be. But this time, I stayed steady, present, but no longer overextending myself to make everyone else comfortable. That's when the tension became harder to ignore. One evening, my phone lit up again, this time with a message that was noticeably more careful than the first. Someone asking if they had done something to upset me. The wording was soft, almost cautious, like they were stepping into unfamiliar territory. I read the message twice, my chest tightening in a way I hadn't expected, because this was the moment I had quietly hoped for months ago. But now, it felt different. I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't immediately shrink my feelings to keep the peace. Instead, I let the silence sit for a moment longer than I normally would have, long enough to recognize what was really happening. For the first time, my absence was creating discomfort they couldn't easily brush aside. I replied calmly. Told them I was fine, just focusing on myself a little more lately. The words were simple, but the shift underneath them was anything but. Because the truth was, I wasn't playing the same role in the family dynamic anymore. I wasn't the one constantly reaching, constantly adjusting, constantly making sure the connection stayed intact no matter what. And they were starting to feel the difference. From that point forward, the energy around me carried a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. Nothing explosive, nothing openly addressed. But the small glances, the slightly more attentive tone, the careful check-ins, they all pointed to the same thing. They were noticing the space where I used to stand. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to close that gap, because something inside me had finally settled into a calm I didn't recognize at first. Not cold, not distant, just clear. Clear enough to see how long I had been trying to hold a place that had been slowly shifting beneath my feet. Little by little, the truth became impossible to ignore. My family had been pushing me aside for months, maybe longer, and I had kept chasing their approval as if working harder would somehow earn back the space I was losing. But now that I had stepped back, the imbalance was finally visible in a way it had never been before. The silence between us carried weight, and for once, I wasn't the one rushing to fill it. For the first time, my silence was louder than all the years I had spent trying to be heard. The call came on a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary moment that never warns you your life is about to shift again. My phone lit up with my mother's name, and for a second, I just stared at it. Months ago, I would have answered immediately, my chest tight with that familiar mix of hope and anxiety. But this time, my reaction was different. Slower, calmer. Like some protective layer inside me had finally learned not to rush toward people who only noticed my absence. I let it ring once more before answering. Her voice sounded softer than I remembered. Careful, almost uncertain. She didn't waste time on small talk the way she usually did. Instead, she went straight to the point in a tone that felt strangely unfamiliar. Something had happened. They were in a difficult situation, and they needed help. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Not because I was trying to be cold, but because the weight of the moment pressed heavily against everything I had been quietly processing for months. The same people who had brushed off my feelings, who had slowly pushed me aside while I kept trying to stay close, were now reaching toward me with urgency I had never heard before. And the strangest part was how clear everything suddenly felt. I asked a few calm questions, keeping my voice steady while she explained the situation. It wasn't small. There were real stakes involved, the kind that don't leave much room for pride or distance. Anyone listening from the outside would have expected me to immediately step in the way I always had. After all, I had spent years proving I would show up no matter what. But something inside me had changed too much to pretend nothing had happened. When we hung up, I sat there in the quiet of my living room, phone still in my hand, heart pulling in two completely different directions. One part of me, the version that had spent years keeping the peace, wanted to jump in and fix everything without hesitation. That instinct was still there, still familiar, still strong. But there was another voice now too, quieter, but steadier. The part of me that had finally learned what it felt like to be slowly pushed aside while I kept pretending everything was fine. And for the first time, I didn't silence that second voice. Over the next day, the messages came more frequently. Gentle check-ins at first, then slightly more direct follow-ups. The tone had shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Where there had once been casual distance, there was now careful attention. Where my concerns had once been brushed aside, my responses were now being read closely, almost cautiously. They needed me, not the version of me they had grown used to overlooking. Not the quiet presence they assumed would always be there no matter how little space they made for me. They needed the support, the reliability, the emotional steadiness I had been offering all along. And suddenly, they were paying attention to it. We finally met a few days later. The atmosphere felt different the moment I walked in. Not dramatic, not openly tense, but careful in a way that hadn't existed before. Conversations moved slower. Eye contact lingered a second longer than usual. It was subtle, but I could feel it in my chest immediately. They were aware now. As the situation was explained in more detail, I listened the way I always had, quietly, fully present, taking in every word. But this time, I wasn't shrinking myself to keep the peace. I wasn't rushing ahead emotionally to smooth everything over before they even finished speaking. I stayed grounded in the calm that had slowly built inside me over the past few months. When they finally paused, the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before. I could see the expectation in their faces. The old version of me would have filled that silence instantly, would have reassured them before they even had to ask, would have stepped forward without hesitation. But I didn't move. Not right away. Instead, I took a slow breath and said something I never would have been brave enough to say before. I told them I cared, that I wasn't ignoring what they were going through, but I also told them calmly, clearly, that things between us hadn't been okay for a long time. That I had tried, more than once, to explain how pushed aside I had been feeling. That each time, it had been brushed off so gently it almost made me doubt myself. No one interrupted. No one laughed it off. They just listened. And in that quiet moment, I saw something shift across their faces that I hadn't seen before. Understanding. Not sudden, not dramatic, but real enough to finally settle the question that had been sitting heavy in my chest for months. They hadn't noticed my value when I kept showing up without question. They noticed it when I stopped. The apology that followed was careful, almost fragile, like they were stepping into unfamiliar territory. But this time, I didn't rush to smooth everything over. I didn't immediately shrink the moment to make everyone comfortable again. I let the silence sit just long enough to make sure the weight of what had happened didn't disappear too quickly. Because I wasn't the same person anymore. I was still calm, still steady, still someone who cared deeply about the people in front of me. But I was no longer willing to disappear quietly just to keep the peace. They pushed me aside when I needed them most, but when they finally needed me, I made sure they understood exactly what they had almost lost.